So I will just give an introduction and some ground rules before we start. So hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Harjinder Gill and I will be the moderator for this breakout room. Before we begin, I would just like to take a minute to go over some ground rules to ensure all our presenters and guests have a positive and educational experience. First, we ask that anyone who is not presenting to keep their cameras and mics off during the presentation. This will help eliminate any background noise and distractions. If you have a question or comment, please type in the chat and we will go through them at the end of our Q&A session. Presentations need to be stay within their allotted 15 minutes. When time is up, I will ask the presenter to wrap up their point so we can move on to the next presentation. This is to ensure that all our colleagues have time to share their research. Lastly, we should just like to remind everyone that session is being recorded. Thank you, and now I will pass it to our first presentation.
Can you see my screen?
No, we can't see your screen right now. Yeah, we can see it.
You cannot see, okay. Okay, thank you so much. My name is James Olo. I'm assistant professor right here in the Faculty of Education at the University of Windsor. So thank you so much for taking the time to join to learn with us. My presentation is titled Empathy and Resilience in a Pre-Service Teacher Education Course, an Autobiographical Narrative Inquiry. You may be wondering, what does this have to do with an International Teaching Online Symposium? But I'll come to that in a second. So the presentation outline is as follows. I'm going to talk briefly about introduction and how I came into this inquiry space. I'm going to talk about empathy and resilience in the teaching learning context, research questions that are informing this study. This is an ongoing study, so it's not complete yet. I'll talk about methodology, and there will be some discussions and summary. So coming into the narrative inquiry space, I'm talking about my lived experiences with empathy and resilience as a new professor teaching an online pre-service course. So this was a large class. It was my first class to teach. Actually, the first class as assistant professor. As you can imagine, when you start a new job, there's some excitement and there's some anxiety too. So that was also last fall when I taught this class, was also the first full year when learning was online. So in my welcoming video to my students, I noted that there are students who are struggling with the pandemic, maybe impacting them individually or their family members or their kids. And I was also starting out as an assistant professor. So the issue of empathy and resilience, just being patient with ourselves and with other people, and being resilient to bounce back despite the challenges that we face were quite important. And the reason why this resonated with me is because of my own educational landscape. I came to Canada over 2 decades ago as an international student. And so things were very different. And even though I have a few international students in my class that I taught, there were many students who came to Canada as grown-ups, as adults. In fact, for many of them, the first experience with Canadian education was as a university student, even though their immigration status may not be international students. So for these students too, learning online for the first time was also a challenge for them. So it made me think about my own experience as an international student in Canada. I went to University of Lethbridge in Alberta. I also went to Simon Fraser for my master's degree, and I completed my PhD at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan. So those three cities, the three provinces, the three campuses became my home. I got their health card, driver's license. I got to know the place. So they were like a home to me. So it could make me relate to what my students are going through. This notion of home that they cannot really touch. As Hui writes, home is no longer a place, but a lullaby. For my students taking a required course in the education program during a pandemic, a campus home that is only accessible virtually without touch or smell and under the mercy of technology was quite challenging for some students. There are many cases of mental illnesses and students who needed accommodation. So that was something that was hard to ignore. Hence, the need for empathy. It was important to empathize with my students, empathize with myself, as I also reflect back to my experience as a student, how it was hard to navigate and negotiate my pathway into the country as an international student. So two main research questions inform this study. One of them is, what is the place of empathy in classroom practice? And two, how can I identify and enhance resilience in my students? Because resilience can be enhanced, it can be taught. We don't just assume that everybody is resilient or everybody's gonna be empathic towards other people. So methodology I use is autobiographical narrative inquiry. I regard this study as being informed by the stories of my lived experiences, and that my story, my experience is a meaningful data that can be used to create understanding, not to generalize my finding, but hopefully somebody else, maybe another international student, another researcher, can read that and find it to be meaningful to them. So narrative inquiry is inherently autobiographical in the sense that it is an ongoing reflexive and reflective methodology. It calls on narrative inquirers to continually inquire into their own experiences. Somebody said that before we were born, stories were being said about us. And long after we leave this earth, there will be stories being told about us. But while we're still here, we can make sense of our lived experiences by telling stories. So through narrative inquiry, we are able to have this as a method to understand experience and also a theoretical framework to ground that study of experience. Okay, so the context of empathy and resilience. I have a long quote here because it resonates with what I believe in. It says, teacher empathy is the degree to which an instructor or a teacher is deeply works to deeply understand students' personal and social situations, to feel care and concern in response to students' positive and negative emotions, and to respond compassionately without losing the focus on student learning. So from the teacher perspective, empathy is very important. Parents and caregivers expect teachers to be empathetic towards their students. So it's not just about my relationship with my students, what they were going through, but the class that I taught them was called foundations of practice, classroom practice. So we were looking at ways in which a teacher can act, do things to make the classroom environment conducive for learning to take place. We went ahead and looked at data from Toronto Public School District, and we saw how children who are from racialized backgrounds, Black, Indigenous, and others, they tended to be suspended or disciplined significantly more than other students. We also noted that student behavior, especially the unconstructive behavior ones, are usually purposeful. So a student may misbehave because there's something that either they are missing, they have a need that is not being met, or there's something that's a skill that is missing. So they don't understand something, they have a psychological need that is not being met, and that may make them act a certain way. So if you link that with the level and rates of school discipline by race in Toronto School District, in our classroom, we could see how the issues of empathy were coming into fore. So it's not just empathy towards my student, but also teaching my students of the importance of having empathy towards their own students when they become teachers. And regarding resilience, all students, all of us in here face adversity at some point in our life. And the pandemic made things even worse. It was harder for many people. Almost everybody was impacted. So because adversity affects all students, being resilient is important for everyone, and especially being able to teach resiliency in our students. So we don't just assume that he's a strong guy, he's going to bounce back and become resilient, but we need to teach this not just to university students, but so that those teacher candidates can do the same thing when they're out there in our schools teaching. So as we approach the end of the semester, I became even more convinced that empathy should always be an essential piece in every school setting. This was important to me because, as Gea reminds us, there is a gap in literature on how to cultivate, teach, and learn empathy. We need to teach students how to be empathetic, and especially education students, so that they can be empathetic towards their students in the classroom. So the concluding remarks is that this study highlighted the link between empathy and resilience and argues that both are an essential part of effective classroom practice. They can be taught and fostered. I came to that conclusion from my own experience as an international student in Canada from Kenya, who studied in 3 different campuses in 3 different provinces, and now I am an assistant professor teaching students, including those from other parts of the world. They have unique challenges. Everybody does. But I think that as a previous international student and as somebody who has the opportunity to work with students who are either international or are from somewhere, I am more placed, perhaps, to be more understanding towards these students are going through, and I am able to make sense of this, make meaning of this to help me work with my teacher candidates so that they can become better teachers of their students. So with that, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, James, to show the importance of empathy and resilience. If you guys have any questions, you can drop them in the chat box, and we will go through them one by one after all the presentations are done in our Q&A sessions. We can move over to next presentation. Thank you.
Are we ready? I'm hearing an echo. Okay. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to this series of presentations. And thank you, James, for a very moving and important reminder about the importance of empathy and resilience. My name is Simone Hengen, and I'm an English language teacher at the University of Regina. I'm speaking from the territory where the University of Regina is situated, which is Treaty 4, the traditional territory of the Nahiawak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Michif Nation. I'm very grateful for this opportunity extended by those who are in the territory of the Three Fires. I myself am a settler descendant on Treaty 4, and my ancestors were homesteaders here in the province of Saskatchewan. So we've been hearing for the past 2 days about how cultural and language differences in our students have brought additional challenges for educators and students in the response to the pandemic and the transition to remote learning. And as I said, we heard from James about how stressful this shift has been. In the language learning sphere, a student's level of language acquisition can produce additional challenges. And even more additional challenges come because so many language learners are newcomers who are not familiar with the construction of a settler state like Canada. And they have a perception that Canada is a peaceful, prosperous G7 nation. Their perception is at odds with their life experience in Canada, what they see on the news, the stories they hear about the discoveries of the residential school and the uncoverings of those aspects of our shared history. And international students then have many questions about their new home. In my English language classrooms, I support student inquiry into ways that they situate themselves in the settler state. So today, using the context of language education, I'm advocating that educators continue the work of decolonizing our classrooms while building the pedagogical knowledge and skills required for blended, bisynchronous, or online environments. And so this conceptual paper will focus on connections between post-structural identity theorizing and approaches to decolonizing classrooms, with some extension into principles to take into teaching. Much of it applies to both face-to-face and online learning environments and other disciplines. The intersection of this paper and the topic of the symposium is really the point that we should be finding ways to continue to decolonize our virtual classrooms. Decolonizing teaching and identity work go hand in hand. Like other EAP instructors in Canada, and with the support of indigenizing initiatives at the U of R, I've been learning the histories of land seizures, of withholding food, treaty making, the pass and permit system, the impact of the Indian Act on Indigenous women, and the horrors of residential schools and the forced learning of the colonizers' language. Learning these histories challenges how I belong in and how I belong to Canada. These histories have transformed my sense of self in relation to my citizenship, my race, gender, white privilege, education, and what I receive in healthcare. I'm still on that journey, mindful that decolonization is not a metaphor, and wary of moves to innocence that might distract me from that emotionally hard work. The challenge of being on a journey like this and decolonizing the classroom seems to compound the already challenging task of learning online pedagogies. But I'll discuss some theoretical approaches to identity construction that I hope alleviate this challenge. Oops. As a teacher, I've been trained to come to the classroom with a relatively stable and fixed teaching identity. as an expert who has achieved a plateau of knowledge. This approach to my teaching identity is very dissonant with the personal learning journey that I'm on. Contradictions arise in that I'm asked to present myself as an expert language teacher while questioning the ethical implications of teaching the language of the colonizer on Indigenous lands. So it's helpful for me to allow the possibility that post-structural theorizing offers that our sense of self is not fixed, but is changeable and unstable. Whedon's definition that you see here describes my experience of my identity as a decolonizing settler-descendant English language teacher. My subjectivity or response to social roles is precarious, contradictory, in process, constantly being reconstituted in discourse every time I think and speak. So I accept that my sense of self is not constant or a final state, but is situated, is being in place, is in constant evolution, and therefore navigating change. This position might seem familiar because, frankly, it's what we're experiencing now. The teaching identities that we took into our pre-pandemic classrooms are being reshaped by remote teaching and learning contexts, new technologies, and responses to a global pandemic. We have much work to do to synthesize the effects that isolation and response to COVID on our teaching identities and our students' identities will look like. So a perception of identity as fluid then provides a theoretical approach to facilitate that work of reshaping our identities in the light of the pandemic and of involuntary remote teaching. And I think there's an opportunity to ensure that decolonizing work continues as we adjust to a post-COVID teaching environment. Decolonizing is not an additional unit that we add onto a syllabus. It's deep identity work that takes place within the educator and the student. So allowing for precariousness and contradictions in our teaching selves and in our students as well has the same use in decolonizing our classrooms as it does in adjusting our teaching to a post-COVID environment. This identity work is important because the discourses of colonialism are so powerful and pervasive. As a settler, I often experience the impact of the statements that you see by Foucault and Butler, that we have so little agency. We're constituted so entirely by the discourses that surround us. I acknowledge even that I draw on research based on Western academic knowledge production, even while I resist that knowledge production. So this force is daunting, it's off-putting. But here too, I think that embracing the precarious, the contradictory, even multiple nature of identity can become a tool to navigate the discourses of colonialism. In his later work, Foucault contends that resistance of a discourse begins within, with reflexivity, with an awareness of the operation of a discourse within one's personal knowledge building. He introduced this positive ingredient of his analysis of subjectivity, as de Souza and Furlan say, considering what a subject can do for his own life or existence, and not only from the perspective of what the other makes of him. In other words, Foucault is describing an inner search. And in that inner search, Foucault included practices of reflection, including journals, engaging in dialogue with others, and a search for a truth that is not empirical truth, but which is ethical. And you see from the statement by Whedon that Whedon calls this identity work a battle for power within the individual. Again, that important identity work taking place within the individual is what I see as the place where those conflicting histories of what we grew up with and of what we are learning from the uncovering of colonialism in Canada come into conflict. That place, that site, that inner journey is the messy, contentious, and precarious and contradictory site of the battle for understanding who we are and for building our own subjectivity and sense of identity as treaty people on treaty nations, or as people in settler Canada. And this identity work can become an important tool in decolonizing EAP classrooms. This advice comes from multiple voices, including the teachings of Cree professor Angelina Weenie, who taught me that the history of my family in Treaty 4 and my situatedness on Treaty 4 is at the core of decolonizing work that happens in my classroom. And I'm not sure how to pronounce the name of his nation, but author Bob Joseph and Cree elder Joseph Netauhau also teach that the critical justice work of reconciliation begins with an inner journey of knowing oneself. Within language teacher identity research also, language teacher researchers use a similar post-structural theorizing of identity. Morgan conceptualizes a fluid identity in his work. In 2004, in his classroom, he mentioned that he enjoys cooking for his family. His students expressed surprise at what they saw as an activity atypical or maybe even inappropriate for his gender. And from that point, he says that in his language classroom, and I quote, "How I viewed myself and presented myself in class changed frequently in response to students' comments and queries." As he wrote in 2017, language teacher identity is reflexive and transformative, a site of agency and pedagogy that, as he wrote in 2015, can be jeopardized with the commodification of the language classroom. So I embrace the idea that my teaching identity is not fixed, and I'm encouraged to consider that the openness to transformations in my settler identity that come from learning accurate histories is a pedagogical strength and not a burden. And it's also a lot like our openness to the transformation of our identities that accompany our technological, emotional, and psychological response to COVID-19. What I'm saying is that we have the tools to continue to adjust or to allow our identity to form and allow that identity formation in our classrooms. Language students are also vulnerable to reproducing stereotypes and filled with questions about their new home or their new place of study. In a research study conducted in 2013, student respondents told me what you are reading on this slide. And as you can see, they have questions about how Canada is constructed. Beth, as a refugee, was moving from a condition of statelessness to citizenship, and she could not piece together how citizenship or how belonging to Canada was not a positive thing, or how Canada as a settler state has benefited some to the detriment of others. Basil, as you see, identifies that the relationship between settler and Indigenous, there's an element of fakeness there that he sees. And David, in his very telling statement, "At least they should have taught me the truth," gets to the heart of it. So language learners will construct their Canadian and English language identities, It's my belief that a fluid conceptualization of identity will be a useful tool for teachers to navigate both their own and their students' journeys. And on this final slide, there are some means to engage identity formation in the classroom. And these include allowing that precariousness, conflicted and evolving teacher identity and student identity, speaking from situatedness, teaching accurate histories of colonization using authentic materials and using those accurate histories to discuss systemic racism, encouraging reflection through journals and talking circles, using inquiry methods to open dialogue, and encouraging what Kanagaraja calls safe houses, which are clusters of students in their first language groups, which affirm their students' linguistic diversity and knowledge construction. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Stop share, that's what I need to do. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you so much. So I would like to repeat it again. If anybody has any questions, you can drop them in the chat box and we will go through them one by one. And answer sessions. So it's time for our next presentation. Next presentee, you can take over. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hopefully you guys can all hear me and see my slides. Let me get that ready. I'm Nirmani Vijayanayaka. I'm from the University of New South Wales, Sydney, Australia. I'm from the School of Biotechnology and Biomolecular Sciences. So I'm from the science faculty. And what I'm going to talk about today is how I use group work as a way to help students build learning communities. So the specific course that I'm talking about in this presentation is based in the discipline of biochemistry. It's called Big Fat Myths, and it's a course that's offered to all the faculties in the university as well as all the year levels. It's a fully online course, and what that means in this specific course is that it's almost like a Coursera course where all the course content is available from the very beginning, and the students kind of engage with them on their own independently. And that can be quite unmotivating for them, and they can become quite disengaged because there aren't any live lectures or any opportunities for them to interact with other students in the course. So I really wanted to come up with a way to allow students to have some engagement and peer-to-peer interactions and allow them to hopefully build some learning communities because the students have been fully online for a whole year due to COVID, and without having any interactions, that could become really, really isolating for them. So one of the ways that I thought that I could fix this issue was by introducing a group project, a group assessment to the course, so that the students can actually have the opportunity to have that interaction with each other. So I did end up introducing a group project that was worth 30%. So this specific course ran this year from February to April, and I had 410 students. 66% of these students were international students, and then 34% was local. Out of the 66% international students, 2/3 of them were based overseas because they were not allowed to come back to the country due to travel restrictions. So at my university, we have a term system, and each of our terms are 10 weeks long. So it's fairly short. So the students were meant to get into a group of 4, and the task that they had to do was to produce a video critiquing the safety and the effectiveness of 2 popular diets. And this specific project was due in week 9 of the term, so basically at the end of the term. And the students couldn't really get started on this project until about week 5, just because they haven't learned enough to be able to complete it yet. But I didn't want to put the students into groups in week 5 because I thought that was already too late. I wanted them to start having interactions from week 1 onwards so that they can start building a relationship, so that by the time they come to do the project in week 5, they would feel a lot more comfortable with each other. So that would make a more smooth process. So I had to come up with ways to basically get the students to engage from week 1. So what I did was I created a Microsoft Teams account for our course and added all the students into this account. And in week 1, I posted this message. It was a challenge just to introduce themselves to the rest of the course. I wasn't sure how much engagement I will get from this. So to make sure, I posted some pictures of myself just over the summer, introducing myself, showing my dog, and just talking a little bit about myself to get the ball rolling. And I was so surprised by how engaged the students were. Pretty much every single student in the course actually made a post. So this is just a few images, about probably 1% of what I got. They started posting about their own holidays. They posted about their, pets, the food that they've been eating. So this student here posted a picture of him having Chinese New Year with his whole family. And so it was really amazing to see. And what I did was I basically reacted to every single message that they posted, and I sent them all a personal message back, having a conversation. Usually if it's, if they posted a picture of their dog, I would say, oh, what's your dog's name? If they posted a picture of food or something, I would go, oh, what is that? Where do you get it from? I wanted to acknowledge their posts, because a lot of the times if a student do something for the class, and if no one acknowledges them, especially an instructor, throughout the term, they're going to feel like no one cares about what they're doing. So I really wanted to set the tone right from the beginning and really let them know that I'm around and I am actually caring about what they're doing. So at the same time, I also wanted the group to get to know each other and start kind of bonding with each other. So what I did was I sorted the students into groups myself, because it's fully online. It's quite difficult for the students to naturally form their own groups. And once I put them into a group of 4, I ended up putting them into a private chat on Microsoft Teams as well. So I had 109 groups altogether. So there were 109 private chats for the students. I posted a message kind of explaining what the chat was for, and then I gave them an icebreaker activity that they had to do that first week. So the icebreaker activity was basically an online scavenger hunt. I gave them like a list of items that they had to find, and then they had to share with the rest of their group. So something like the most expired item in your kitchen, or a DVD that you're embarrassed to own, or the thickest book that you can find in the house. So some fun random things. And so the students started posting pictures of these items that they found, and some students, like you see here, were actually just explaining what their items were. So it was an easy way to kind of introduce themselves to each other without it feeling like it was being forced on them. I also really encourage the students to use this private chat as a safe space for them to talk to each other, and a space for them to basically carry on with their project. And I really encourage them to call each other up on a weekly basis to touch base with each other. So in week 2, I had a conflict resolution workshop. So if you ever worked in a group, you will be quite familiar with having potential conflicts as you work on a project. And I wanted the students to be really aware of certain conflicts that could happen, and having the tools to then deal with it. So each of the groups were given a bunch of scenarios. So this is just an example. So you're going through a hard time due to a personal issue, and that has affected their ability to do the work. And therefore, you've been ignoring the group chat, even though the group members have been messaging you to find out what's going on. So I would prompt them with questions like, how would this affect the group? What should you do? What advice do you have for other group members? And what might be some steps so that you can actually move forward with the project. So it's really about raising awareness about potential problems that they will face during the term, and discussing it as a group, so that if it does happen to them later on in the term, they actually have the tools to deal with it themselves without having to rely on me to sort it out for them. Once they went through the scenarios, I got the students to then write down a set of group rules that they all agreed on, things about deadlines, or when to have group meetings, when to start the project, and so on. So in week 3, I had another challenge for them. This was probably my favorite challenge for the students. I told them to just go outside and make a short video clip of their environment, where they were. It could be their house, could be a favorite place to eat, just going on a walk. So I said to do that individually, and then share that video clip with their private channel so the other group members can see. And then I asked one of the members to combine all the short video clips together into one video and then post it to our main course channel as a reply to this post. So there were two things I wanted to get out of this one. First, I wanted the students to really appreciate how diverse they were. They were all coming from all over the world. So I really wanted them to acknowledge that by doing this. And the second thing was I really wanted them to understand how long video editing takes. Their final project is to produce a video. So I wanted them to realize that they can't really start the day before because video editing is going to take a long time. So by doing this, a fun kind of task of making a video would hopefully raise that awareness. This was really amazing to see. The videos were so great. I felt like I was on a virtual tour around the world because I was seeing these video clips from China, from Germany, from Oman, all over the place. And it was such a rewarding experience just for myself to see where my students were coming from. In week 4, I wanted the students to really think about the group roles and the roles that they might play in the whole project. I specifically wanted them to think about leadership. So I encouraged them to nominate a leader for their group. And I said that it could be a leader that you can have for the whole rest of the term, or it could be a leader. It could be a situation where you rotate the leader. So every person get the opportunity to lead the group. And all they had to do was kind of have that discussion and then put into their group chat what their leadership plan was for the group. Week 5, they were getting quite busy with all the other assessments and stuff, so I didn't want to challenge them too much, but I did provide them a bunch of resources that would then help them with their projects. So some online, free online courses on video editing, some things around group work, professional development. They were optional tasks, so the students could interact with them depending on how much time they have and how much interest that they had. In week 6, we have what we call flexibility week at my university. It's kind of like a mid-session break. So the students get the week off to kind of relax. And I really wanted them to think about their own health and well-being. So I just made few suggestions, try to get at least 7 hours of sleep this week. Try to meet with a friend, make your bed, go for a walk, just make the time to relax for that week because everyone was getting quite busy by this point. Week 7, I challenged them with this where, so in week 8, the students had an individual exam coming. So I really wanted them to try to study for this exam ahead of time. So their challenge for this week was as a group to come up with 2 to 3 multiple choice questions for the exam around certain topics so that you have some practice questions to work with. And this was a way to, again, encourage them to study, but also getting them to talk about these quite difficult concepts with each other, because in order for you to write a good multiple choice question, you would have to have a pretty good understanding of the content. And by talking to each other in the group, it will then encourage them to also realize how much they know and how much they need to study. And at the end of this, I had a whole bunch of practice questions that I could release to the students so that they could have the chance to have that as preparation for the exam. With all of these challenges, I try to keep them as relevant as possible for the project and the course. I didn't want to give them some random challenges throughout the week. I wanted them to really appreciate the challenges and realize that there is a reason why we are doing these challenges and that they are actually beneficial for the whole course. So week 7, 8, 9, they were basically working on their video and working on that. And I was available in the background to help them whenever they needed. And these are just 3 screen captures of 3 videos. So I had 109 videos altogether. So many of them were such amazing quality. So this one here, the students decided to make an animation. So they had this character called Jane who was struggling with weight loss. And the students were the ones who were the experts who were advising Jane on what to do and what not to do. This group decided to kind of go and do a normal PowerPoint presentation, but the way that they were speaking, you could see how comfortable they became with each other. So that was really, really nice to see. This group decided that they were going to do kind of like a health news section. And so they had the news presenter asking about these diets, and then they had these experts coming in to answer their questions. So I said that, with the video, they can be as creative as they wanted. The only conditions that I had was that they had to show their face in the video and they had to speak in the video. So other than that, they had complete creative freedom, and they just came up with these really, really cool ideas that I didn't even think of. So because this is the first time that I tried this out, I wanted to see what the students thought. So I decided to do a short survey. It was an optional survey. So because of that, I didn't have everyone replying to it, but I had 80 responses. So these are just a few questions that I thought was relevant to this particular presentation. So I asked them, did the group project taught me valuable skills to work effectively in a team? The group project helped me learn at least one new skill from other group members. The group challenges helped me to bond with the group. I felt we were given enough support to do well in this project. So this was a 5-tiered Likert scale, and you can see that in most of these, the students were either agreeing or strongly agreeing with these statements, which was quite nice to see. But obviously, we still had few students who were, not having the greatest experience, which, obviously is a bit of a worry. And I think these challenges might explain why that might have been. So one of the things that came up was the workload between international versus local students. And so I had a really huge cohort of international students, and there were some of them that were quite struggling with English. So they were less fluent, and some of the local students felt like that they had to carry on a higher workload to make sure the quality of the work was good enough. And so they felt like there was an unequal distribution of work. I had a group contribution form that the students had to fill out as part of this project. So that was one way to kind of mitigate that, so I could fix the marks accordingly. Obviously, this did only happen in a handful of groups, but it's something to be aware of. The second thing was the different time zones. I made the decision in the beginning of the year to keep the groups as diverse as possible so the students can get different perspectives and learn different skills from each other. I didn't want to put the students from the same country together, and therefore that kind of led to the problem of not being able to find a time for them to meet, because they were all across the world in different time zones. Students having different expectations. I think this is going to be a problem whenever you have group work, irrespective of the course, because you're going to have students who are, who just want to pass the course, and then you're going to have the students who want to really get a high mark. So there's that conflict of some people not putting in enough work that we will have to deal with. I guess the other aspect is obviously being fully online. The engagement can suffer a lot, especially when the students are having group meetings, and you can have shy members who, they don't want to turn on their video and they don't want to speak. So all of the communication might happen through chat, which can be difficult if every other member is joining via, if they're speaking and they have to wait for the other person to chat. So there's obviously that, and it's really about confidence building for the students. And I feel like I need to add maybe some other challenges that allow the students to kind of build their confidence throughout the term. I guess the other thing is the amount of supervision that this required from me. There was a lot of interaction, just keeping up with all their posts and making sure that I was acknowledging them. That did take a lot of time, but I found this whole experience to be extremely rewarding. I felt so close to my students. I got to know some of them really, really well just through Teams. They had quite a lot of access to me. They could talk to me via Teams anytime, and then I would get back to them. And if there was a problem, I could just quickly ring them up through Teams and fix it. So I really felt like it was such a fun term for me personally. And despite the challenges, when I asked them about what was the best part of this group project, there were so many students who actually said it was that interaction that they had with their group. So, being able to engage with people that were from completely different backgrounds, getting to know the other students, learning from other students, the collaboration and being creative with other group members. I really like this one where the student was like, the best part was the group meeting time where they actually got to talk to everybody. I could see it was clear. Obviously, there were some groups that didn't do well for whatever reason, but most of the groups, they actually did form friendships at the end. It's funny because we have term 2 happening right now, and the course was all over, but there were some students who were still active on the group chat where they were wishing each other good luck for the upcoming term, and some of them were like, oh, let's try to meet up back on campus when we are all back. So it was really nice to see them forming these kind of friendships. So that's all I have. I just want to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak today. I really enjoyed it. And thanks to the other 2 presenters. It was really nice to hear what you're all working on. And if anyone have any questions, feel free to email me, or I'll be happy to take any questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's all for today from our presenters. If anybody have any questions, you can raise your hand and we will let you ask the question, or you can type in the chat as well, and we can go through it. Thank you.
It
James
is 5:10 a.m. I woke up at 4 a.m. So it's pretty early.
I would like to, this is Simone here, pose a question for James, if that's okay?
Sure.
Sure. James, the way you put together empathy and resilience is really, it's powerful. The longer it sits in my mind, the more it's really taking root, and considering that being empathetic really does make us resilient. I think it's something that's going to live with me for a while. And I'm just wondering if you could share with us a little more about how you came to put those together.
Okay. I like what you've said. I completely agree with it, that if you are resilient, you are most likely to be empathetic. You know how we say that if you've been through a tough situation, you can at least understand or relate to somebody who's going through a tough situation. So in the education context, we have international students who are coming. And if you look at the demographics of international students in Canada, almost a majority of them are ESL, or they come from countries where English is not the main spoken language. And so when they come, there's the issue of language, the issue of culture. Actually, the culture is usually even much more serious than sometimes we think. Because if you look at, for example, a 21-year-old from a certain context, a certain culture, the expectation of them may not be the same as a 20-year-old in Canadian context. Another thing too is, I don't know if I'm overgeneralizing here, but a good proportion of international students are graduate students. And so when they come to Canada as international graduate students, and some of them get research assistantship or teaching assistantship, that is a good thing. But it usually has a lot of challenges to how they relate to local students. Are they being, for example, from my own experience and experience of other students I spoke to, and I wrote about this in my PhD dissertation at the University of Regina, by the way.
Yeah, I heard, yeah.
So you find, for example, that when the students, just from the cultural aspect, so from my experience in Kenya, the teacher usually is an authority figure. The place of the teacher and the place of the student is very clear. And then as an international student, graduate student who is doing teaching assistantship, suddenly you get confronted by a student who tells you, can you explain to me where I lost 8 marks, 8%? If you got 92%, they want to know where they lost 8. And sometimes the way they ask that can be very strong in the context of where the graduate student is coming from. So there are things like that. So once this graduate student goes through this, or international student goes through this, if they are in a position where they talk to other international students, or they talk to teacher candidates who may become teachers, then their experience may come up in their teaching, and the issue of empathy will always come up. But I think that for all international students, resilience is always there. Those challenges we've spoken about, if you come from somewhere else, you still come here and you succeed, then there's the issue of resilience. Then when you combine that with empathy, it becomes a really beautiful thing.
That is so interesting. And I mean, as an ESL instructor, I've certainly seen that resilience. And as, are you familiar with World University Service of Canada?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm the faculty advisor of WUSC at the University of Regina. And for those who aren't familiar with it, their flagship program is to sponsor and settle post-secondary refugees from hotspots in the world. And those people who come here and who study are so inspiring. Their resilience and their empathy go hand in hand too. And if I think about on another tack though, moving from the post-secondary bubble into the society, I'm going to think about what you said in terms of empathy of our international students for all members of society, particularly Indigenous people who are overrepresented in the really poor health indicators and social indicators. And so what I see is important in the decolonizing work, and why I wanted to do this presentation and explain how important it is for me to advocate for this, is because international students need to understand where their empathy should be and how to understand the situation of Indigenous people who are suffering and why, and the impact of intergenerational trauma. And they're not going to learn that from many contexts. And ESL students, when they come into the ESL classroom, there is an opportunity for ESL programs to use decolonizing teaching as a vehicle for language learning. But instead what happens is that language learning teaching is usually quite banal, flag waving. It is not critical. So I see in developing that empathy and building that resilience for international students, not just to operate within the academic environment, which is an important home, but also the broader new home. And many people become citizens to understand what it means to be walking on seized and settled Indigenous lands is crucial, I think, for Indigenous students. I mean, for international. Indigenous students already know, my God, for international students.
I totally agree with you. Before coming to University of Windsor, I worked for Gabriel Dumont Institute. You are familiar with them, the Métis Institute.
We could do an elbow.
Yes.
Right on the screen.
So one of the things that I remember having a nice, memorable discussion was that how when international students come to Canada, somehow people are going to form opinion of people. It's just not normal. And when we don't do what you are talking about, when we don't use language to decolonize, especially in a timely manner, these ESL students are going to learn and believe the stereotypes that are attached to Indigenous people. And once they learn that, when they're still new in the country, it can be so hard to unlearn that. It's easier to believe that. Yeah.
Very well said. You should have given my presentation.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree, because obviously Australia is in the same situation as Canada when it comes to that. And I don't think, I don't know if our ESL classes actually do that for our international students. That would be something interesting for me to find out, because as someone who wasn't originally from Australia coming into the country, it's like James said, it's whatever people say about others. I wasn't ever taught properly, what you should do, how to do the, like when you do that respect in the beginning, I almost feel like a fraud doing it, because it doesn't come naturally to me, and it doesn't feel authentic doing it because I don't know all the history. So I think it's a problem that people who come from outside maybe faces, just because there's no opportunity for us to learn it, whether it's through university or from somewhere else.
Universities in Regina typically have indigenizing initiatives in which faculty and students, staff can take advantage of learning opportunities. So I hope maybe that will be true of Australia too at some point.
Yeah, I hope so too.
The most interesting explorations that I've encountered, and the books that were in the slide that I showed, though, are the ones that delve into government policy, the systemic racism of government policy that sets the course in which, I was brought up in a settler background and had no other, no foundation except for that. No way to really learn the accurate histories of the country. And my family is on that course too. That's like the rudder, is the colonial discourse that's embedded in the government discourse. And when you see the letters that they wrote back and forth, like the letters, the legislation. Okay, I'm getting worked up here, because this is just so important. The letters they wrote, the legislation, what they said, like the Hansard debates and minutes, the things that they said are unbelievable. And that's what I mean when I say that when you read those histories, they go in somewhere, and then things happen inside here that it's like what happens in here changes your vision, change my eyes. And then so if I just take the time to allow that percolation and that work to happen, that's when I get that learning and when I get that more feeling of belonging. And so I'm just throwing that out as a suggestion. There are resources somewhere that tell you what the government did and what the government said and how the government held back Indigenous people.
I like that so much. One of the books that you had there was The Inconvenient Indian. I have it in my collection. And speaking in general, I like what Saskatchewan is doing, maybe Manitoba too, that a number of Indigenous writers are able to tell their stories. And when that annual Saskatchewan Book Awards, whenever they hold it, you see that there's a category for Indigenous writers, and these writers are getting acknowledged. Because somebody said that, I can't remember her name, I have a book. She talked about the people, the lowest in the society, not being able to speak. Can the Subaltern Speak was the title of her book. Can the Subaltern Speak? And she takes a very big history. Like, for example, those who work in in factories in India, the women, the widows, they're trying to have a voice, but nobody hears that voice. And in some aspect, you can see that in the Canadian Indigenous literature, because you can ask, can the Indigenous really speak for themselves? Yes, they can. They have been doing that for a long time, but we have just not been listening to what they say. But if we decide to listen to what they say, their stories, like the Inconvenient Indian, the book that you had there, then we take a step back and realize that it is not just the recent report of 125 kids who were killed in Kamloops, but rather this story has been ongoing. We were just not listening to them.
Shinwak's vision was written in the 90s. In the 90s, you know, this is not, it's not news. It's getting to be old news. We should know. But if I read with a colonized mind, that information goes into the colonizing process, and it goes a certain place. But when transformation happens, and it's slow and it's incremental, but it happens, it does happen, then the blinders come off and you realize that the impact that colonization has on people. I don't know if you know, James, Dr. Shawneen Pete, who is now retired, an Indigenous professor within education. And one thing that she said, which impacted me greatly, was she talked about how she lost the family's Cree language. And when her dad died and they were at the funeral, the Cree language was being used. And so she could not understand the prayers that were being said for her dad at his funeral. And that went in, you know, and I started to think that that's impact. I mean, that's impact on someone's personal life, you know, and it just brought home a lot. And that was a little awakening. Those things happen. Yeah. Well, this has been a wonderful afternoon or morning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Manny, your presentation was really inspiring. That was great.
Thank you. Yeah, just trying some new things out. It's been a bit crazy being fully online, especially with science, because we can't do our labs. But yeah, but the students are back on campus now, so it's not too bad. Yeah.
I like what you've said there, Imani, that you are a scientist and you also focus on the pedagogy, on how to teach your students. Sometimes we think that only teachers do that, but
Yeah.
you talking about lab, being a scientist, but looking at how exactly can I improve the learning experiences of my students. That's a good thing.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I was just listening to you guys talk about your topics, and what I realized is it's probably because I'm coming from a science background, there's not that much around Indigenous people in our courses, other than we try to incorporate in the sense of, like, you know, like I sometimes teach the students about the development of medication and stuff like that. So we talk about how in the olden days other people have used traditional medicine, that sort of thing. So we do try to incorporate that, but it's not to the same level that you guys are doing from your faculties. But I'm assuming, or I'm hoping that's the same at UNSW, that they are learning that through other faculties. And one of the good things for us is that we have these things called general education courses, where the students from, you know, if you're a science student, you're meant to go to another faculty and learn their courses as part of their degree. So it does open up some doors for them to learn about different things other than just their specific discipline.
Mm-hmm. That sounds good. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, Kathy typed.
Oh. That's painful, Kathy. Oh, I feel that. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. So when language loss comes with intense personal emotional loss. Thank you for sharing, Kathy. That's very intense.
Kathy, there's I don't know if you know this, there's across the river in Windsor, in Detroit, there's I attended 2-3 years ago a really nice event, a Japanese New Year celebration or something like that. And they had, yes, they had, somebody was talking about in general the contribution of Japanese people to what America is today. But there's a little old lady who talked about something similar to what you've talked about. It was just sad that nobody seems to talk about that. It seems to be hidden, but it needs to be talked about. Recently, we saw the Prime Minister apologize to the people of Italian descent. I don't know if apology has been made to Japanese people, but what they went through was real and very painful.
It was a formal address made by Brown Mulrooney. It was called The Redress, and it changed my husband and it changed his family. And it was through my experience of living in a mixed marriage, of raising mixed children, and of being faced with great prejudice and racism, which I'd never experienced as a white child growing up, but I chose to go into a mixed marriage. And then learning the horrific way he was raised, I really started to understand the reconciliation. So I felt very akin to, even though it wasn't as bad, I mean, the children weren't murdered, but I felt I had a better understanding than if I had not been through this experience as a, married in a mixed race. But we are still working through his scars. That became my karma, was working with him, and I'm a better person for it. There's no doubt, but he's taught me so much. He taught me so much about being middle class and just, my limited thinking. It broadened me, and having to stand up for my own children, it changed me. So maybe that's why I'm so interested in also English language learners. And Manny, what you were doing with your students just blew me away. Like how you build community with people all over the world. I just think that's fantastic. So there are very personal reasons why we do what we do.
Yeah. I like something you said there.
All of you.
I'm sorry, James.
Sorry, Kathy, I like something you said there. I won't ask you to repeat it, but you talked about you are having to stand up for your kids. I just hope that the kids are not going through a tough scar, to use your word, like their dad went.
It wasn't as bad because they weren't as hated. I mean, my husband was hated. His words were, "I was raised as the enemy." So, but my kids were picked on a lot, and now it's recycling because now there's an Asian anger because of pandemic. So I'm finding I'm very protective again. And my kids are grown up, but it's still there. It's still, it just resurfaces, and it's shocking and it's sad. But anyway,
it's sad too, because usually in the public discourse, we were looking at people of Asian descent as the good immigrant, the ideal immigrant. In the school, they're smart kids, they don't get in trouble with the law, with the police. Then suddenly things turned around and people of Asian descent became the enemy so fast. I don't know if the feeling was always there and we were just lying to each other and waiting for the opportune time for things to blow up, or if things suddenly just became bad.
I think to a degree, there's always been racism, and there always has. And I've even worked with teachers who said, you know, you're seeing things that aren't there. They aren't racist. And I said, they are. Listen to what they're saying. Listen to what they're doing. My kids have been chased out of parks because they were chinks. You know, it was like, okay. And I had to learn to go after those kids and follow them and find those parents and tell them how they'd raise their children, tell them what I thought. Yeah, it's just, I think it's there. I do. I think they're raised to be that way. They're raised to think they're superior. They're raised to think they're entitled. But, you know, we all work at it, right? We just keep working at it.
So this is where I think that this post-structural theorizing of identity is useful, because it tells us that someone can be these multiple and conflicting aspects. They can be within one person and appear at different times. That's the nature of humanity. We're not settled. We're not fixed. We are constantly in flux to a degree that can surprise us. And the pandemic has really pulled that out of us in terms of what we need to do as teachers and who we are as teachers, where we're a certain way. No, we're not. We got to pivot. And if we can pivot then, we can pivot in other ways as well. But on the flip side of that, there's also some things that I'm not so proud of going on in here. And if I don't look at them, if I don't see it for what it is, where there's racism in me, which there must be because of the way that I was raised, even though I'm working at it, I don't want to be, but if I'm being honest with myself, I could probably identify ways that my behavior follows systemic racism without resisting it at all. That's in there too. And so that conceptualization of identity, to me, it's really helpful to just, instead of getting more sort of worked up, just think, okay, that's human nature. And then what can we do about it now? You know, what is the best use of my energy? Because it's not fighting the fact that we're multiple, and it's not trying to stay the same. It's something else.
Yeah. Moving forward.
Moving forward.
Thank you all for your great work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Like, I never thought being a moderator in this breakout room, I can learn so much, many things that I have learned today. Thank you, guys.
Yes.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
You too.
Yeah.
Bye.
Are you going back to bed?
Bye. Thank you.
I think
Yeah.
I'm wide awake now.
Okay.
Maybe an afternoon nap.
All right. Take care.
Well, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Good meeting all of you, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your
Bye.
time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.